Hello there. I didn't see you. I was so captivated by my book. I'm wearing a headlamp today because I'm in the cave of my closet. Sometimes you wear headlamps when you go camping. Sometimes you wear them when you go spelunking or caving, and that's in a tight spot underground. So I hope that maybe you can find a cozy cave somewhere in your house to settle in and enjoy a story. I'm getting ready to read the next chapter in Horten's Miraculous Mechanisms. I hope you'll join me. When we last left off in Horten's Miraculous Mechanisms, Stuart and his father were visiting the Beaton Museum. His father and the museum curator had just entered into the room Stuart was in, where he was making quite a disaster. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 20. Stuart and his father didn't talk much on the way home. Stuart hadn't been able to think of a believable explanation for the horse-smashing incident, so he had simply said, "I'm really, really sorry," to the curator, and "It was an accident," both of which statements were true. His father had silently written out a check. The curator had stood in the front entrance and watched them leave. He hadn't actually said, "Go away, you disgusting vandal, and never darken these doors again," but he might as well have done so. Halfway home, it started to rain heavily. "I really am really sorry, Dad," said Stuart, dripping as they turned the corner onto Beach Road. "I know you are," said his father, but he looked worried as well as soaked. When they got into the house, Stuart saw him pick up the phone right away. Stuart went to his room and flopped on the bed. He felt exhausted. He had wrecked the museum and humiliated his father, and all he had to show for it was a bag of inedible toffee. He took it out of his pocket and looked at it. He'd been certain that each of the museum machines would provide him with a number, but what number could he extract from an unmarked paper bag containing a large brown lump, one huge toffee where there had been once a handful? And then, all of a sudden, he seemed to hear a little chirpy voice. "You put in 3 pence and you got a little bagful. Always exactly the same number of toffees." Lorna, the woman in the blue glasses at the bingo hall, had told him that. And then her friend V had chipped in with the precise number. 12. She'd said 12. So if the first number was 12 and he had to guess the other two, how many goes at the safe would it take before he got the combination right? He fetched his calculator, tapped out 29 by 29, and groaned. That was still far too many. And in less than a week's time, Uncle Tony's house would be demolished and the safe lost forever, crushed under tons of rubble. He had to sneak back into the museum, secretly. He had to sneak back, undo a couple of screws on one machine, and then swing an enormous great hammer in order to ring a very large bell on the other. Secretly. And if he didn't manage it, he would never find the workshop, and more than that, he would never find out what happened to Great Uncle Tony or to Lily. It was then that he remembered the scrapbook Leonora had given him. He reached down and pulled it out from under the bed, brushing dust balls from the cover. He looked again at the first photograph of Great Uncle Tony holding the 3 pences, and then he began to turn the pages. The first few pictures were all of children, of Lily presumably and her sister Leonora, of Tony and his big brother Ray, Lily and Tony always grinning, fighting, shouting, jumping, a blur of energy and action. Leonora always holding a book, looking shyly at the camera from behind thick spectacles. Ray always serious and slightly disapproving. Photograph followed photograph. Gradually the children grew up. The boys acquired mustaches. Lily smoked a daring cigarette. Leonora held up a certificate from St. Cubert's College showing that she'd qualified as a teacher. There were flyers from Tony's magic shows, an ecstatic ecstatic reviews of his performances and pictures of Lily in glamorous costumes, and on the final page of the book, crumpled and slightly torn, was the yellowed newspaper clipping that had fallen onto the road the day before. Stuart smoothed it out. It was the top half of a page from the Beaton Advertiser of September 1940. It showed a photograph of Great Uncle Tony and Lily holding hands and grinning hugely at the camera. He was wearing a tin helmet with a W on the front, and she was in a nursing uniform. Beaton celebrity to marry. Teeny tiny Tony Horten and his lovely assistant Lily Vickers posed together after announcing their engagement. Speaking to our reporter yesterday, Mr. Horten, who is also a volunteer air raid warden for the Beaton Park area, said, Stuart heard a soft noise like a sharp click, and then another, and another. Stuart hauled himself up and went over to the window. April Kingley was standing on the sidewalk holding a handful of pebbles. Go away, he mouthed through the glass. She shook her head and threw another one. Stuart opened the window. What do you want? He asked as rudely as possible. Did you know you're being watched? Asked April. Yes, he said, by you. She shook her head. Seriously, there's a man about 40 years old, a bit fat, dressed in green trousers with no distinguishing features apart from a white dove that keeps flapping around wherever he's hiding, which is currently behind the hedge at number 22. He turned up not long after you got home covered in mud again, and then when you went off with your dad a bit later, he was sneaking along about 50 feet behind. Incidentally, why were you covered in mud for the second day in a row? It wasn't mud, it was soot. All right, well, why were you covered in soot? It's none of your business, said Stuart, annoyed to learn that Clifford was still following him. He closed the window. A few more pebbles smacked against the glass. He opened the window again. Stop it, he said. April folded her arms and looked at him with her head tilted to one side. Her expression was incredibly irritating, a mixture of condescension and sympathy. I think you're in some kind of trouble, she said. No, I'm not. And I really think you should tell someone about it. Me, preferably, because I'm really good at keeping secrets, and because I'm quite brave, and also because my journalistic contacts. You don't have any journalistic contacts, Stuart said. You're 10 years old. My journalistic contacts, she continued determinedly, mean that I'm a really useful person to know. Go away, said Stuart. And I'm a fast runner, she added, and I always win at dares, and my report card said that I never take no for an answer. Stuart started to close the window. And I'm bored, April shouted. I'm really, really bored. I can't find any crime to report, and my sisters aren't interested in investigative journalism. All they want to do is copy stuff out of the paper. Anyway, she added, I bet you need help. He hesitated, his hand on the window latch. He did need help. Without it, he'd never get back into the museum. He'd never find the safe combination, and he couldn't give up now. He just couldn't. He took a deep breath. Okay, he said, I'll meet you in the yard in 2 minutes. When he got outside, Stuart wished he had chosen somewhere else to meet. He had forgotten that April was tall enough to rest her chin on the top of the fence, whereas he could only see over into the yard next door if he stood on tiptoe. So, said April, looking down at him, what's going on? Stuart thought hard. He didn't really trust her, so it would be best, he decided, to give her as little information as possible, and not to mention the coins, or the machines, or even Great Uncle Tony. He would have to be very, very clever about it. All right, he said, if you need to spend 20 minutes in one of the rooms in the Beaton Museum without being disturbed by anyone, how would you do it? "What's this, a quiz?" asked April, frowning. "In a way," he replied mysteriously. "Well, what do you need to do for those 20 minutes?" she asked. "Do you want to borrow something?" "No." "Steal something?" "No." "Have a go on one of those old-fashioned slot machines in the back room?" His jaw dropped. "How do you know?" "Everyone wants to go on those. They lock them up when school trips come around. They'll only work with old 3-penny bits. Have you got some?" "Ugh, I bet you have. Where did you find them?" "Ugh, did they belong to your great-uncle Tony, who had the house? Did they?" Stuart nodded dumbly. It was hopeless. She was just too clever for him. "You might as well tell me everything," said April. "Go on. Please. Please." In a way, it was a relief to be able to tell someone the whole story. April listened carefully, her expression serious, the sunlight bouncing off her spectacles. When he'd finished speaking, she was silent for a very long time, and then she cleared her throat. "I don't believe in magic," she said. "Nor me," said Stuart, "but then neither did Great-Uncle Tony until the night of the fire." She nodded slowly. "And as a crime reporter," she said, "I've developed an uncanny ability to spot when someone is telling the truth, and I know you're telling the truth." She closed her eyes for about 3 seconds and then opened them again. "Right," she said. "I've got a plan." "What, already?" "Yep," she grinned. "I told you I was good." "I haven't heard the plan yet," Stuart said coldly. "It's quite simple," she declared, "and we can do it tomorrow. Tomorrow night. Now listen." Chapter 21. The next morning, Stuart woke quite late. He lay in bed for a while, idly listening to a pigeon cooing outside his window, and then a sudden thought struck him. He scrambled out of bed and pulled open the curtain. What he saw wasn't a pigeon, but a white dove, Clifford's white dove, and it fluttered up from the windowsill and flew in a wide circle above the road, settling at last on top of a hedge. A hand appeared above the hedge and made a grab for the bird. The dove flew off, leaving a single white tail feather behind. Stuart closed the curtain again. He could hear an unusual noise, he realized. It was the sound of his mother's voice coming from downstairs, which meant that she was still home at halfway through the morning on a weekday. "Hi, Mom," he said, coming into the kitchen a few minutes later. "Are you ill?" "No, no," she smiled breezily. "Just fancied a day off. I wanted a little bit of rest after the move, organizing all of our clothes and shoes and so on, and putting stuff in the attic." "Okay," he said, not terribly interested. "Are you doing anything today?" she asked. "No," he said. Then he remembered the plan. "I mean, yes. Yes, I am. You know those girls who came around the other night?" She nodded. "They invited me to their house this evening. It's next door." "Oh, that's lovely," said his mother, looking so thrilled you'd think she'd won $1 million. "What are you going to do there?" "One of them's making pizza," said Stuart. "And then we're going to watch a movie on TV. I'll be out quite late, till at least 10 o'clock. Is that okay?" "Of course it is. It's the summer," said his mother. "What's the film?" "It's about volcanoes." "Shield, cinder cone, or composite?" "Don't know," said Stuart. "Is it cinema verite, or is there a fictional component?" asked his father. "Don't know that either," said Stuart. "Anyway, they've asked me to come around there at about 5. Next door, he knew April would be telling her parents that she'd been invited to Stuart's for the evening. The plan was simple and cunning. It might, he thought, actually work. The day seemed to pass slowly. Stuart spent most of it lying in the front of the television, but every now and again he got up and checked out the front window. He didn't actually see Clifford, but a couple of times he spotted the dove, still circling the rooftops. Upstairs, his father worked in the study, and his mother opened and shut closets and moved things around. Once she popped her head into the living room and asked him if he'd seen his walking boots since moving to meet Beaton. He hadn't. At last it was 10 to 5. Stuart stood in the hall and shouted a casual, "Bye, see you later," up the stairs. He opened the front door, counted to 3, and then shut it again, deliberately, noisily, before tiptoeing back through the house and into the yard. April was waiting on her side of the fence. "There you are," she said. "Clifford's definitely still out front, so we'll have to escape the back way. Take this. You'll need it." She passed a kitchen stool over the fence to him, and after a moment of irritation, Stuart stood on it and climbed over to her side. There was a piece of rope tied to one leg of the stool, and she hauled it across after him. "Where are your sisters?" asked Stuart, glancing at the back windows of her house. "Printing off the next edition of the Beach Road Guardian," she said. "Hurry up, can't you?" She had already placed the stool beside the next fence, and they both climbed over, picking their way through a cluster of plastic gnomes and around a miniature wishing well. "Only 3 more backyards to go," said April. The final fence bordered a small paved alleyway. April tucked the stool behind a garbage can and then tiptoed along to the corner and peered around. "He's still there," she hissed. "He really is the most useless spy. Anyone with half a brain could outwit him." "Come on," said Stuart. "The museum closes at 6. They ran side by side out of the other end of the alley and then slowed to a fast walk for the rest of the half-mile to the museum. "Right," said April, stopping dead when they were within sight of the main door. "Repeat the plan to me again." "I don't need to," said Stuart. "I know it." "But we should go through it again, step by step." "Why?" "Because that's what makes a good plan into a great plan." "Okay," said Stuart. "We go in, you start a conversation with the ticket woman so that I can sneak past. I go to the bathroom to open the window, we hide somewhere, we come out when the museum's closed and everyone's gone home, we put the coins in the machines, we get out through the open window. Now can we go?" "Did you bring a flashlight?" "Yes." "Did you bring a screwdriver?" "Yes." "Did you bring the 3-penny bits in a proper wallet rather than just letting them jingle around in your pocket?" "Yes." "There's no need to get cross," she said brightly, setting off again. Stuart took a deep breath and followed her. The first problem was that standing right in the middle of the foyer was the museum curator, Rod Felton. Stuart ducked behind a large shrub outside the entrance and beckoned to April. "That's the one who saw me wreck the horse," he whispered. "Go and talk to him about the Roman ballistics." "About what?" "Weapons that throw things," Stuart said, feeling a bit like his father. "Ask about the siege engines." "What are those?" "Things for knocking down walls." April nodded and scurried into the museum. Peering from the undergrowth, Stuart could see the electrifying effect of the word ballistics on the curator. A conversation began, Rod Felton waving his arms around, and April nodding keenly. She was good at this sort of thing, Stuart had to admit. If only she wasn't so patronizing and annoying and incredibly, unbearably bossy. The curator guided April to the model of the Roman ballista, and she started pointing at different parts of it and asking questions. Lots of questions. And the woman at the ticket desk was writing down something while talking on the phone. Stuart seized his chance. He bent over and ran at a crouch straight through the open doors, past the back of Rod Felton, and into the first room of the museum. Then he straightened up and, pretending to be a normal visitor, followed the signs to the men's bathroom. There he found the second problem. He'd intended to unlatch a window so that April and he could get out of the museum later on, but the only window was quite high up and he couldn't reach it. Beaton Museum seemed to be full of things that he couldn't reach. Stuart exited the bathroom, heard the words, could hurl a half-ton boulder more than 100 yards with the use of twisted sheepskin thongs, coming around the corner, and dove back in again. Immediately there was a crackling noise and a click. "Beaton Museum will be closing in 5 minutes," said a voice from a loudspeaker above his head. "Please make your way to the exit." Stuart peered out of the bathroom again. Visitors trickled past, heading homeward. There was, he noticed, a door marked "Janitor" just opposite. He was about to investigate when April sprinted around the corner, spotted him, and gestured frantically for him to follow. They ran past the wartime classroom and the wartime grocery store. "Here," hissed April, swerving at the sign that read "Air Raid Shelter" and hurrying down 2 small steps into the dark interior. It was a very small shelter, just a curl of corrugated iron containing a bunk bed and a bench. "In there," whispered April, pointing toward the lower bed. She climbed the ladder to the top bunk, while at the bottom Stuart pulled the blanket over himself and lay as flat as possible. The blanket smelled of wet dog. The mattress was lumpy and slightly damp. "Beaton Museum will be closing in 1 minute," said the voice on the loudspeaker. Stuart counted very slowly to 1,000, trying to breathe through his mouth so as not to have to smell the blanket. All was quiet outside the shelter. He was just about to speak when he heard a distant whining noise that gradually grew louder. It was then he realized an electric floor polisher. Slowly the noise passed them and faded away. Stuart started counting again. When he got to 8,210, he heard a set of footsteps and then a click. All the lights went out. The footsteps went off into the distance. Shortly after that, he heard the faraway crash of a heavy door closing, followed by the sound of a car being driven off. He pulled the hairy blanket away from his face. It was pitch black. They were all alone in the museum. Chapter 22. Stuart's flashlight had a wide yellow beam, and April's a narrow bluish one. As they walked through the darkened Beaton and Wartime exhibition, their lights crisscrossed, giving sudden eerie glimpses of a figure in a gas mask or a dummy on a stretcher splotched with fake blood. Stuart nearly walked straight into the waist-height model of 1940s Beaton, and as he lurched over it, his flashlight swept across the miniature rooftops and gardens, lighting up something very odd, something that he hadn't noticed before. "Hey, look," he started to say, and then he realized that April was hurtling ahead into the next room, flashlight beam bouncing. He hurried after her, past the horse, now back on 4 legs, with both ears restored, and into the final room. "Right," she said, ducking under the rope that cordoned off the coin machines. "Which first?" She shined her flashlight between the bicycle tire repair kit machine and the Try Your Strength one. "The bicycle tire repair machine," he said, fishing in his pocket for the screwdriver. April watched impatiently as Stuart got to work on the first screw. "Was that a car?" she asked suddenly, cocking her head. "Didn't hear anything," said Stuart, concentrating hard. "I hope it wasn't." She sounded anxious. "What if somebody saw our flashlights through the windows? Did you open the one in the bathroom incidentally?" "No." "Why not?" He shrugged. He was tired of admitting that he was too short to do things. Didn't have time. He'd lied. "What do you mean? You had ages. You had all the time when I was being lectured on those stupid Roman throwing things." "Yes, but it was complicated." "What was complicated? How are we going to get out? What if we're stuck in here for the night?" April said. "Look," he said, feeling exasperated. For all her cleverness, April was an awful worrier. "I'm trying to unscrew this. Why don't you put the money in the fairground machine?" "Oh, can I?" She sounded thrilled. "Just start it up," he said quickly. "I'll do the hammer thing." "Okay." He took a 3 pence out of the other pocket and handed it to her, and then with a couple of twists finished taking out the first screw. "Done it yet?" he asked, starting on the next. "No, not quite. It won't go in." "Give it a real shove," he said. "I've had to do that on some of the other machines." The second screw came out quite easily, and the metal strip that covered the coin slot fell to the floor with a tinkle. Stuart pushed a 3 pence into the slot and pressed a button. There was a metallic clank, and a small object landed in the compartment at the bottom. It was oblong and no wider than his hand. He shoved it unopened into his jacket pocket. "You ready?" he asked, straightening up and shining the flashlight in April's direction. She was crouched over the try-your-strength machine, tugging at something. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm really sorry." "What do you mean?" Stuart shifted the beam of light so that it lit up her hands. Between her fingers, she could see half the 3 pence sticking out of the slot. "It's the wrong one," she said. Stuart leaned over. There were 2 slots next to each other on the front of the machine. One looked large enough for a 3-penny bit. April, for some reason, had stuck the coin into the other, narrower one, meant for 6 pences, and it had wedged there. "Why on earth did you do that?" he asked sharply. He pushed her hands aside and tried to wiggle the coin. It had jammed fast. He inserted the flat end of the screwdriver beside the 3 pence and moved it around, and the slot started to cave inward. He tugged the coin again, and this time it came out. He held it up and stared at it in the blue flashlight beam. "It's bent," he said accusingly. "You've bent it. It's ruined." April said something, but in a voice so muffled that he couldn't hear the words. "What's that?" he asked. "My stupid eyes," she said. "I can't see very well in the dark, even with glasses, and the flashlight makes them go all dazzly. I didn't notice the second slot until it was too late. Stupid eyes, stupid glasses. Ugh!" He heard her swallow a couple of times and knew that she was trying not to cry. He felt furious, not only with April, but also with himself. He'd told her to give the coin a real shove, and that's what she'd done. And then he blamed her. It took him a moment or two before he could bring himself to speak. "I've got another 3 pence with me," he said, forcing the words out. "It's okay." She swallowed again. "Look, why don't I go and open the window in the bathroom while you're doing that?" she suggested. "At least I can try and be a bit useful." He heard her footsteps leaving. "April!" he called out. "What?" Stuart took a deep breath. "The window was too high for me to reach, but I think you'll be able to reach it," he said. "Okay." Her footsteps disappeared. Stuart inspected the try-your-strength machine. It looked straightforward enough. You hit the iron mushroom with a mallet, and a small weight was sent whizzing up a vertical groove toward the bell. The mallet looked enormous. He tried to lift it, but it was held in place by a metal catch. He rested the flashlight on top of the toffee dispenser so it could cast a clear light onto the strength machine, and then he pushed the 3 pence into the slot. There was a click as the metal catch fell away. Easing the mallet off its hook, he tried a couple of practice swings and did some deep breathing to get his strength up. "Right," he said to himself. He took off his jacket, drew another deep breath, lifted the mallet, and at the exact moment that he began to swing it, there was a sudden movement in the shadows to his left. Startled, he half turned, and the weight of the mallet threw him off balance, and he staggered back a step, and then sat down very hard on the iron mushroom. It bounced slightly, and there was a pathetic ding from the machine. Beside the coin slot, a little drawer shot out of the mechanism. Stuart reached for it, but another hand got there first. A large but slender hand with polished nails and a bandaged thumb. "Goodness me," said Jeanie, taking a card the size of a bus ticket out of the drawer. "Whatever is this?" Chapter 23. Weakling. Stuart's heart seemed to stop. The flashlight rolled off the toffee dispenser, bounced across the floor. For a moment all was darkness, and then from over his shoulder another flashlight clicked on, illuminating Jeanie. She was standing just in front of him, holding the card. On the back of it, in large black letters, was printed the word weakling. "So tell me," said Jeanie conversationally, "what is the significance of this little object?" "I don't know," Stuart answered truthfully, his voice not much more than a squeak. "Can I have it back?" he added, reaching out a hand. "Not yet." She frowned as she read something on the other side of the card. "It's all very puzzling, and I presume that you've also been interfering with the other machines?" "No," lied Stuart. Jeanie stooped into the shadows, and when she straightened up again, she was holding his jacket. Stuart made a grab for it. She snatched it out of his reach. "Clifford!" she called. Stuart looked around and saw the dazzle of a flashlight beam, and then felt his wrist grabbed from behind. Almost immediately they were released again, but now somehow he couldn't pull his hands apart. His index fingers seemed to be stuck together behind his back, and the more he struggled, the more tightly they were linked. "That's better," said Jeanie. "Very well done, Clifford. You're well on your way to a distinction in grade 2. She lowered Stuart's jacket again, felt in the pockets, and took out the little tin case. "Top Marks Tire Repair Kit," she read. "That's mine," said Stuart. Jeanie ignored him and opened the lid. "Glue, sandpaper, and a rubber patch?" she said disgustedly. She'd snapped the lid shut again. "Where's your little friend?" she asked. "What friend?" "The girl with the glasses who obviously thinks she's rather clever. Wrongly, since it didn't occur to her that Clifford was acting as a rather obvious decoy. I was able to observe your fence-climbing activities at my leisure and then follow you to the museum in my car. Anyway, where is she?" "She got scared," Stuart fibbed. "She wanted to go home, so I said okay." He was feeling scared himself, though he tried not to show it. "When we met at my factory," said Jeanie, "I distinctly remember asking you to come to me if you found out anything useful about your uncle's workshop. What I don't remember saying is, please arrange a secret meeting with Leonora." "It wasn't secret," said Stuart. "It's the ingratitude I cannot bear." Jeanie's voice rose in anger. "When I first met that sad old thing, she was trying to sell Grave Street and not getting any buyers because it was a crumbling wreck. Typical teacher, you see. No money, no business acumen. She'd saved nothing for her old age. She didn't have the faintest idea of the true value of what she had." "What do you mean?" asked Stuart. "All your great-uncle's early tricks, the bird cage, the money box, the finger trap, were simply collecting dust on her coffee table. Ingenious, beautiful objects left lying around unpatented. I'm a businesswoman, Stuart. If I see an opportunity, I grasp it. I took the house off Leonora's hands, bought up the old factory site at the bottom of the yard, built a warehouse on it, gave her a lovely rent-free flat in the basement, and began to manufacture your uncle's inventions. The business took off like a rocket. You'd think she'd be grateful, wouldn't you? You'd think she'd be unlikely to sneak off behind my back and give information to a small and nosy boy? I tried to have a conversation with her today, but it wasn't satisfactory. Old people can be so stubborn, and that dog is surprisingly vicious. Broodingly, she rubbed the bandage that covered her thumb. However, she added, I have a feeling that you might be able to tell me more rather than she did. Stuart said nothing. Jeannie leaned toward him so that her face was close to his, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet and reasonable. Let's be sensible about this, she said. What would you do with that workshop if you found it? I can make use of it. I transformed a few little tricks into an empire of magic. Just think of what I could do with that feast of illusions. No foreign counterfeiters could possibly copy those. She held out the card and the bicycle tire repair kit. I believe that you're following a trail of some kind, Stuart, and if you can tell me what these objects signify, then I'd be very grateful. And generous. I'd be ever so generous. How about a lovely new bike for a start? She smiled. Stuart shook his head and her smile disappeared. Jeannie straightened up again, her face rigid, her uninjured hand gripping the card and the little tin. Let's go, shall we? Stuart felt Clifford grasp his shoulders and began to march him across the room. Where are you taking me? He asked, his voice rising. No need to shout, said Jeannie. We're going somewhere secluded to have a chat about your findings so far. Let me go! No. My mom and dad'll be worried. What a pity. You should have thought of that before you broke into a public building after dark. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, and Stuart felt his breathing tighten with fear. He tried to shake himself free, but the grip on his shoulders was too strong. One by one, Stuart first, then Clifford, then Jeannie, they passed through the narrow doorway into the room with the tools and farm animals. As the flashlight beam leaped across the walls, Stuart saw a shadow move to his left. It was a slow, rather elegant movement, like the spoke of a wheel spinning around, and in an instant he knew what it was. He coughed loudly to cover the thud of a wagon wheel hitting a large, fake cow, and then he went boneless, dropping like a stone. Clifford stumbled over him, and there was an exclamation from Jeannie as she banged into the back of her student. Oh, for goodness sake, now I've dropped the card, she said impatiently. And please stand up, Stuart. Behaving like a toddler is not going to help you in any... Then she shrieked as a giant fake blacksmith swooned out of the darkness, a vast hammer in his hand. In the chaos, Stuart found himself momentarily free, and he rolled into the shadow and staggered to his feet, hands still linked behind his back. Bathroom, he heard April hiss. He heard the patter of feet ahead of him, and her flashlight blinked just once, showing the way to the next room. He followed, zigzagging from one flashlight blink to the next, lurching against exhibits, stumbling through doorways, until April doubled back and took his elbow, dragging him along with her. Stuart could hear the rapid click of Jeannie's heels now, walking swiftly just a room or two behind. Here, whispered April, shoving Stuart through the door into the bathroom. I found a ladder in the janitor's room, she added. I'll go first. She scampered up the step ladder to the high window and disappeared. He could hear the thud of her feet hitting the ground outside. Stuart followed, sticking his head and shoulders through the open window, and then coming to a halt, his stomach lodged on the windowsill, his feet waving. April dragged a bin across, climbed on it, grasped the neck of his sweatshirt, and pulled. Stuart barely had time to cry out before belly flopping into a bush. From inside he heard the crash of the ladder, which he must have kicked over as he fell. April helped him haul to his feet and then sprinted. Stuart headed after her, but nearly fell 3 times in the first 100 yards. "Can't balance! Gotta undo my hands!" he gasped. He knelt down in the gap between 2 parked cars and tried to tug his fingers apart. "Let me see," said April, stopping and crouching beside him. She gave his hands a wrench, and he yelled out, "What are you trying to do? Break my fingers?" "I can't understand it," she said. "There's a shiny metal tube, and you've got a finger in both ends. Just pull." "I'm pulling." "Pull harder." "I can't. It hurts. It." And then he stopped talking as he heard a noise and saw a light. Not footsteps, but a siren and the screech of brakes. Not a flashlight, but the spinning blue lamp of a police car. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Horten's Miraculous Mechanism chapters. We will be finishing up the story in the next 2 weeks, so stay tuned. Have a great day.